The northern plains are covered in snow, with winds sweeping across the open grassland and pushing temperatures well below zero. But under a huge earthen dome, 20 people rest in comfort. There is no sound of a furnace and no electricity runs. Only wood, animal hide, earth, and flame are crafted into such an exact system that Europeans from the 1700s would enter and describe it as an oven. This was not a matter of chance. From the Arctic shores to the desert highlands of North America, native builders transformed harsh winters into livable periods using heat management techniques. It was as good as anything made in that time period. They comprehended the real nature of cold, not a foe to be overpowered, but a physical challenge that could be solved through building design. Every kind of dwelling like earth lodges, hide teepees, igloos made of snow, and semi-subterranean pit houses offered a distinct solution to one common dilemma. How can you retain warmth without metal, glass, fossil fuels, and when winter goes on for half a year? The solution involved taking advantage of the physical properties of resources that many would think unsuitable. Compressed snow served as insulation. Bison hides formed dead air thermal shields. The ground acted as a heat sink, taking in warmth by day and giving it back during chilly nights. Each component had its function, and each architectural decision addressed a particular issue in the constant battle against losing heat. Begin with the most basic physics challenge. A fire generates heat, but a portion leaks out via walls, via roofs, and through every gap and joint. As soon as heat spreads outward, cold air quickly enters to replace it, so the primary engineering hurdle was not generating heat but holding it in on the northern plains. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples erected dwellings that operated like heat storage devices. Construction of an earth lodge started with a shallow, circular excavation. Above that, workers erected a structure of cottonwood logs, large beams that created a dome measuring about 66 feet across. Over the timber framework, they placed layers of willow twigs, prairie grass, and finally a 1-2 inch thick covering of turf taken from the prairie. This dirt layer was not just for looks. Soil has high density, dense substances take in heat gradually and give it off gradually, a characteristic known as thermal mass. In the daytime, while the main fire kept burning, the thick soil and walls absorbed heat. At night, when the fire diminished to embers, those identical walls released the saved warmth back inside. The lodge acted as a thermal buffer, flattening temperature fluctuations after being warmed. It stayed warm for many hours without needing more fuel. Snow piling up on the roof actually boosted efficiency. Newly fallen snow is largely air-confined in countless small cavities that hinder heat transfer, the exact concept behind contemporary foam insulation. Therefore, blizzards that covered the lodges and snowbanks in fact raised their warmth, providing another layer of insulation over the earth. However, the thick walls introduced a fresh issue: smoke. No family could inhale wood smoke for half a year continuously. The answer was careful ventilation design. At the roof's summit, the builders left a round hole. It was exactly sized to exhaust smoke from the fire pit underneath. If it were too big, valuable heat would escape. If too small, the smoke would suffocate all within. Mandan builders improved on this by positioning an upturned bullboat, a wood frame clad in animal skin, over the smoke aperture. That covering functioned as a chimney top, redirecting the wind and avoiding downward air currents while still letting smoke rise out. On extremely frigid nights, extra hide curtains could be tweaked to narrow the opening, exchanging some airflow for keeping heat inside. The smoke opening turned into a precisely controlled air vent, and inside, the layout boosted effectiveness. People slept on elevated wooden beds constructed next to the walls, 2 feet above the packed dirt floor. Because cold air settles, by sleeping off the ground, residents remained in the warmest heat zone while cold air collected without issue down low. Every bed was covered with bison skins, moss stuffing, and braided reed mats, layers that hold bodily heat next to the person. As many as 20 family members occupied a single lodge, but this was not solely a custom, it was a heat management tactic. Human bodies emit warmth. A sleeping individual gives off about as much heat as a 100 watt bulb. When combined, 20 individuals produce 2,000 watts of constant warmth even with no fire. Inside the confined space of an earth lodge, This shared heat notably increased indoor temperatures, and the bodies themselves became an element of the heating apparatus. Archaeological findings show how seriously builders took heat management. Researchers discovered fire pits lined with stones that reflect heat, arranged to direct radiant warmth towards sleeping spaces. In some lodges, earth mounds and berms were constructed behind the hearth, slanted to propel heat forward instead of allowing it to dissipate through the rear wall. Each element had a specific function. On the plains, where bison herds moved with the seasons, permanent earth dwellings were not feasible. Hunters who traveled required shelters that could be taken apart and transported, leading them to design an alternative: the tipi. A tipi appears straightforward, a cone-shaped frame of poles draped with stitched hides. However, its thermal efficiency resulted from complex layering. During summer, a single layer of bison hide repelled rain while still permitting ventilation. For winter, builders inserted an inner lining, raised inside the framework a few inches away from the exterior wall. This formed an insulating airspace, a layer of motionless air caught between two layers, and still air is a very poor heat conductor. This is the reason birds puff up their feathers when it's cold, capturing air next to their skin to preserve body heat. The double-walled tipi utilized this identical concept. Heat from the indoor fire was unable to get to the frozen outer hide, as it first had to traverse an insulating air gap. Simultaneously, the inner lining soaked up radiant heat and reflected it back toward the people inside. At the bottom, builders piled snow against the outer hide, sealing off drafts and providing extra insulation. The tipi became a thermal envelope, a protective covering with several defensive strata: an outer hide, a dead air layer, an inner lining, and ultimately the warm inner core where inhabitants dwelled. Smoke control operated under a different principle compared to earth lodges. At the peak of the cone, two movable panels projected outward like wings, and by adjusting these smoke flaps using external poles, residents could change the vent's direction to avoid the dominant winds. When the wind was still, the flaps were opened fully to permit unrestricted ventilation. In windy conditions, they were partially closed to stop downdrafts that would smoke up the inside. A scientific investigation directly assessed the tipi's heat regulation. During freezing temperatures, scientists positioned thermometers in various spots within a classic winter tipi. They discovered that individuals seated close to the fire experienced warmth equivalent to people in oil-heated contemporary houses. This was not due to the tipi producing additional heat, but because every individual took up merely 1/10 of the area. The small interior meant that warmth from bodies and fire had no outlet, and each unit of heat remained focused on the people inside. Yet this posed a final design difficulty: how to get a good night's sleep when fire and smoke vied for fresh air. The solution involved arranging bedding with the same precision as the walls. Bison hides were placed with the fur facing downward on the floor, capturing heat adjacent to the ground. Additional hides were stacked with fur facing upward, forming a bed that protected sleepers from both bottom and top. At night, hunters enveloped themselves in extra hides, creating personal thermal cocoons within the layered coverings. Even as the fire extinguished during the night, body warmth had no escape, yet the sleepers remained warm until morning. Far westward, tribes of the Pacific Northwest encountered distinct winters: more moisture, more wind, but less extreme cold than the plains. Their answer was to build underground. Constructors from the Hoopa, Salish, and Maka tribes dug floors about 3 to 6.5 feet deep, then erected walls using split cedar boards and covered them with dirt. The earth itself served as insulation. At depth, soil temperature remains fairly stable all year, protected from surface climate fluctuations. By placing floors beneath the frost line, pit houses access this inherent heat stability. Walls encased in mounded earth could not radiate heat to the external air since they were not in direct touch with it. The building became thermally integrated with the ground mass, which functioned as a massive heat storage. In the dry southwestern region, the ancestral Puebloans constructed rooms with thick walls using adobe, a blend of clay and straw formed into blocks. Adobe walls with a thickness of 2 feet required several hours to heat through completely, but after being heated, they gradually emitted that warmth over the entire night. The material's substantial thermal mass produced a lag effect, moving daytime heat into the nighttime hours when it was most required. Within the Cherokee lands in the southeast, Winter dwellings were cleverly built with outstanding efficiency. These compact circular buildings, typically only 12 feet in diameter, featured wattle and daub walls, interwoven twigs coated with clay. The walls, constructed of rammed earth, were thick, yet the interior volume was very small, so a modest fire could quickly warm the whole area. Archaeologists have uncovered a feature that boosted efficiency even more. In some winter houses, limestone slabs were set into the floor hearths. Builders would heat these stones in the blaze until they turned orange, then heap coals over them. The limestone soaked up a great amount of heat and emitted it slowly over several hours, acting as an integrated thermal battery. Well, after the fire had gone out, the floor stayed sufficiently warm to provide comfortable sleeping. European merchants in the 1700s, upon entering Cherokee winter homes, said they were overpowered by the extreme warmth inside. They recounted going from icy outside temperatures to chambers that were so heated they needed to take off multiple garments. The Cherokee achieved these high temperatures using only a few coals, thanks to the compact space, heavy walls, and warmed rocks working together as one cohesive unit. Each component enhanced the effectiveness of the rest. Nevertheless, possibly the most surprising heating technology was seen in the Arctic, where Inuit people built dwellings from solid ice. An igloo is a dome-shaped structure made of snow blocks stacked in an upward spiral, with the last block locking everything together. This appears unbelievable. How can frozen water keep you warm? The explanation is trapped air. Compacted snow blocks hold many minuscule air gaps among the ice crystals. These gaps prevent heat transfer similarly to the still air layer in a double-walled tipi. The snow block acts as a cellular insulator, retaining heat inside and blocking the severe cold outside. Inuit builders made use of two extra physics concepts. Firstly, they created a low entryway passage, generally going lower than the floor and then climbing back into the main space. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so it falls. This passage configuration held freezing outside air at the entrance while maintaining warm air within the dome. The igloo exchanged air via this heat barrier. Next, they made a little opening at the top of the dome. This worked like the smoke vent in an earth lodge, letting out used air and burned byproducts while not losing all of the internal warmth. They could partly block the vent using a piece of transparent ice, which let in daylight while cutting down on heat escape. Indoors, Inuit households would temporarily light a lamp burning seal oil or a tiny fire. The warmth from this fire would cause the inside surface of snow to thaw a bit. When the interior heated up, that slim melted coating would freeze again into a sleek, icy finish. This icy coating actually reinforced the building while closing small spaces that could let warm air escape. Measurements taken in lived-in igloos reveal a striking result. When outdoor air dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, indoor temperatures could reach around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. A 40-degree Fahrenheit temperature gap was achieved using snow, human warmth, and a tiny fire. If the residents attached dense caribou hide coverings to the walls, indoor temperatures could rise to 50 or even 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The igloo served as more than a windbreak. It was an effective heat-regulating space. Scientists investigating igloo principles discovered that the shape of the snow dome is equally important as the substance it's made from. A half-sphere is the most robust form for its mass, allowing slender walls to cover big areas without falling. More crucially, a dome offers the least surface area for the space it contains. Because heat leaks out through surfaces, decreasing the surface area compared to the interior volume reduces heat escape. The igloo's own design was perfectly tuned for temperature control. But no single shelter operated alone. Enduring winter demanded combining construction, attire, sleeping materials, fuel control, and group actions into a unified approach. Clothing adhered to the same heat concepts as structures, with several layers of cured hide. Wearing the fur inward kept captive warm air next to the body. Outer clothes deflected wind and dampness, while inner layers gave insulation. Footwear was filled with dry grass or moss, organic substances that held air and pulled dampness from the feet. Within dwellings, bedding schemes multiplied heat conservation. Bison robes, bear pelts, woven covers, and goose feather quilts stacked on each other, forming insulating cocoons. Households often draped additional skins from beams to separate sleeping sections, forming tiny heated zones inside the bigger building. Fuel logistics needed all-year preparation. Tribes from the plains chopped and stored. Wood for fires was gathered in early spring when it was dry. Arctic hunters saved driftwood and seal fat all through the short summer. The aim was not huge, blazing fires those consume fuel and make small spaces too hot. Rather, households kept small, constant fires that generated even heat for many hours. Certain groups employed reflector methods to boost fire output. Flat rocks placed behind a fireplace would soak up radiating heat and reflect it outward into the living area. Shared sleeping involved people lying tightly packed, sharing warmth and coziness. Older individuals frequently got the most heated sleeping positions nearest the fire and at the bottom of the bedding as a sign of honor and as a sensible acknowledgement that elderly bodies had more trouble with cold. Kids slept in between grown-ups, shielded from severe temperatures. Winter additionally became a period for focused indoor pursuits. Tales, crafting, leather processing, and ritual events kept individuals active and producing bodily warmth. These were not merely cultural customs. They served as heat regulation tactics. A person who moves around generates more warmth than someone who stays motionless. The positioning of shelters itself demonstrated environmental cleverness. Traditional plains typists were directed east, putting openings away from usual western winds while catching morning sunshine. Earth lodges were frequently constructed in river valleys, where cliffs stopped the strongest winds. Pit houses were set on slopes facing south to get the most solar heat. Shelters in villages were clustered tightly, forming windbreaks and enabling resource sharing among families. When a household's fire went out overnight, neighbors could swiftly supply coals to relight it, and the close quarters facilitated the spread of knowledge. Should a builder come up with an improved smoke hole design or bedding layout, others could implement it the next season. Such knowledge accumulated over many generations. By observing their parents assembling lodges, children learned the exact angle for stacking sod or the proper tension for stretching hide. Elders transmitted weather lore, including knowledge of which wind directions foretold approaching storms. They knew when to pile additional snow against walls and how to interpret smoke patterns for best ventilation. This engineering was not recorded in manuals. It resided in skilled hands and attentive minds when European settlers first came across these winter housing systems. Many were amazed that German-Russian immigrants arriving in North Dakota instantly recognized Mandan earth lodges as akin to their own thick-walled Northern European houses. They realized that deep earth insulation represented high-quality engineering, not a crude makeshift. Yet other settlers dismissed indigenous architecture as primitive precisely because it employed materials they deemed inferior. They failed to look beyond the absence of metal nails or glass windows to perceive the sophisticated thermal physics involved. It took modern researchers with thermometers and controlled experiments to quantify what indigenous builders already knew empirically, that these structures achieved thermal performance comparable to or surpassing. The experimental TP study, which revealed warmth equivalent to oil-heated homes, was particularly telling. It showed that comfort depends not on energy input but on energy retention. A modern furnace generates far more heat than a TP fire, yet if that heat leaks out due to poor insulation, the inhabitants still experience cold. The TP worked by retaining every bit of warmth within a compact, well-insulated space. This efficiency carried life or death consequences. A family that exhausted its winter firewood in January risked starvation by March. However, a family that designed their shelter to get the most warmth from the least fuel could extend scarce supplies throughout the whole winter. The gap between adequate and superior thermal design could be the line between survival and demise. Archaeological findings show these systems worked dependably for thousands of years. Sites throughout the northern plains hold remains of earth lodges. Coastal pit houses, dating back more than a millennium, reveal continuous habitation. For many winters, Arctic peoples flourished in environments that would kill an unprepared person in hours. These were not desperate survival tactics. They were mature technologies perfected over centuries of use and transmitted as cultural heritage. The sophistication lies in details modern observers might overlook. In certain Cherokee winter houses, builders-oriented, the doorway was placed not towards the simplest building direction but towards the afternoon sun to capture maximum light on the shortest days. Mandan lodges featured entrance tunnels of precisely computed lengths, balancing easy access with preventing cold air from entering. Such knowledge was earned through difficulty. Behind every effective design is a legacy of generations of observation, experimentation. Builders who attempted thinner walls discovered through harsh experience when their families felt cold. Those who made smoke holes too large saw valuable heat escape. Effective methods persisted because they were successful. Unsuccessful trials faded away, supplanted by superior alternatives. The variation across cultures lay in how they adapted to local resources. Plains, tribes had abundant buffalo herds, so hides served as their main portable insulation. Pacific Northwest peoples dwelled in cedar forests, thus using wooden planks for walls. Arctic hunters faced terrain where wood was rare but snow plentiful, turning frozen water into a prized construction material. Every culture refined its designs based on accessible materials while adhering to universal thermal laws. The complexity of these systems questions contemporary ideas about advancement. We tend to think that comfort rose steadily from primitive cold tolerance to modern climate management. Yet an individual sleeping in a well-constructed earth lodge, wrapped in buffalo robes next to a carefully maintained fire, encircled by family. That person would have been subjectively just as comfortable as someone in many modern rural dwellings, possibly even more so. The thermal conditions remain steady, unlike the fluctuations of furnace cycles. The disappearance of this expertise signifies more than just historical interest. Today's architects researching passive heating and super insulation are rediscovering concepts that indigenous builders had perfected centuries earlier, for instance, thermal mass for steady temperatures. Additional principles include dead air spaces for insulation, compact shapes for efficiency, and deliberate orientation for solar heat capture. The technological methods differ. We employ foam rather than snow and concrete instead of sod, but the underlying physics is unchanged. A number of indigenous communities today are bringing back traditional winter housing methods for cultural motives as well as practical advantages. Earth-sheltered houses need very little heating fuel. Correct orientation and insulation can drastically lower energy expenses. This ancient knowledge gains fresh relevance as energy costs increase and climate change calls for more sustainable construction methods. Yet beyond practical uses, these winter survival systems demonstrate something fundamental about human adaptability. When confronted with conditions that appear unfriendly to life, people did not just survive, they devised innovations. They examined how thermal energy travels through substances, experimented with various setups, and retained knowledge of effective methods. Over generations, they instructed their offspring and improved their techniques. The hearth in a mud dwelling, the two-layered teepee, and the igloo with its thermal trap. These were not crude concessions. These were exacting devices tuned to obtain the most heat from scarce resources. They embodied the same innovative reasoning that would later create contemporary urban centers, only executed with distinct implements and substances. The effectiveness of these systems came not from one breakthrough, but from combining numerous minor enhancements into holistic temperature management approaches. Ground insulation was crucial, air pockets were crucial, and chimney opening dimensions were crucial. Take away any part and efficiency lessons, yet when assembled thoughtfully, winter could be endured and even cozy. The constructors of these dwellings grasped a concept that contemporary existence often hides. That well-being is not about overpowering nature with brute strength. Rather, it involves cooperating with natural laws to produce steady, habitable, small-scale climates. They were powerless to alter winter, yet they could forge tiny havens of heat inside it. These were deliberately designed environments where flame, soil, animal skin, and body heat counterbalanced the external chill. When snow blanketed the grounds, darkness enveloped the polar region, and gales howled through mountain gaps. Families remained warm while sleeping. This was not because they withstood conditions better than contemporary humans might, but because they constructed superior structures. They transformed cold weather physics from an adversary into a resource, leveraging each law that could maintain warmth nearby and repel cold. Smoke ascended upward. From a mud dwelling, it was not merely waste. It indicated something further. It confirmed that the arrangement functioned. That slender gray column against the cold heavens signaled that those inside were warm, nourished, secure. It signified that the next generation would acquire the skills and that the flame had not died.